Okay. So, got our three colors here. So when we start talking about temperature, will you close that door for me? When we start talking about temperature, talking about warm and cool, we're talking about the temperature of the color of the paint, the temperature perhaps of the objects that you are painting, but also the temperature of the light. So light has a lot to do with temperature. Generally speaking, unless you have a very dramatic lighting situation set up that is sort of a dramatic lighting situation, most of the time we think of light as being warm. Shadow is cool, right? So when we look at a setup, for example, where the light hits an object is going to be warmer, even if it's almost white. You want to think about the temperature, whereas the temperature on the shadow side is going to be cooler. Same thing happens here, even though the local color here is an orangey color, so it's very warm. You are going to have a temperature shift going across from the light side to the dark side of the object. So you want to be thinking about this in this scenario that we're working with right now. So in order to mix this palette, grab the. So this is what we are aiming for, this color grid, right? So what I'm doing here across this color grid is I'm thinking about starting at the most intense or highly saturated. So saturated is a term that we use to describe how pure that color is, if it's not been modified at all out of the tube. So these are the most highly saturated examples of the color on the corners. So as you mix those two colors together, two things happen. So one thing that happens as it comes across to the center of that saturation scale is it becomes more neutralized, right? So it's modified. So y'all have all studied basic color theory, right? So what are blue and orange? They're complementary colors. Blue, orangey, reddy, brown, right? So they're going to be in that kind of complementary world. So as you mix the two of them together to equal strength, what you get here in the middle is a neutral. It's going to look black, right? So what you get there is a neutral that you can't tell whether it's more orange or more blue, more burnt sienna or more ultramarine blue, okay? So what we want is to reach that neutral point. So when I go step over towards the burnt sienna from that neutral, it gets a little more clearly burnt sienna as it goes out, a little more clearly blue over here on this end of the scale. So what the first thing you're going to have to figure out is how you mix these two together to get that lowest saturation, which is a neutral. All right, we're not going to talk about it as black, we're going to talk about it as that dark neutral value. But you'll see when you look at when I make my value scale from all these colors, that center column should be pretty much gray, right? That should be like your gray value scale that we've already made, okay? Neither blue nor burnt sienna. All of these get cooler as they go out towards that saturated column. These get warmer. Okay, make sense? One of the things you have to contend with is what is the tinting power or the strength of the color that you're using. This varies sometimes brand to brand. It definitely varies with different qualities of paint. The lower the quality, the lower the tinting power. They can look exactly the same when they come out of the tube, but if it's a really low quality paint, it's going to have a lot of what we call filler in it. Wax, other materials, that when you mix it, what happens is that color disperses quicker. So it's not going to be as powerful as really high quality paint. Pull this down so you can see a little bit better. Okay. All right, so I've got a little pile of blue there. And then I'm going to take a little pile of burnt sienna. So sometimes you get a nice neutral if you mix them in equal proportion to each other. And that's what I've started with, 2 piles that are about the same size, the same volume of paint. Doesn't always produce a neutral because one will have a stronger tinting power than the other. So in this case, I've used equal amounts. And this might edge slightly towards, well, I don't know, we'll see. All right, so what happens here, number one, when you've mixed 2 colors together, this is also different from doing it on the computer. Whenever you mix 2 paints together, what you get, you're going to make something darker, right, than your lightest value that you started with. These are both 2 pretty highly saturated, fairly dark colors, so what I've got here is something that's much darker than what I started with. That is just how it happens because it's an additive process. All right, so I want to test. I can't really tell, that's really dark. I can't really tell if it's more one or the other, if it's really a neutral. So I'm going to take a little bit of that I've just mixed. I'm going to put it down here and I'm going to pull a little bit of white. And I'm going to mix it together and I'm going to see, oops, what I've got. So that looks pretty neutral. If I look at that, I can't really say if it's more blue or more burnt sienna. And it's really right in the middle of my value scale that I've already mixed, right? Okay, so pretty pleased with that. So I'm going to scrape up, and I have a nice sizable pile of paint there, okay? So on my burnt sienna end of the spectrum, I'm going to put a little pile of burnt sienna, and down on the blue end, I'm going to put my pile of blue. So just like with my value scale, I'm going to work to fill this area in and to fill that area in. So to do that, I'm going to take a little bit of my neutral, and I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna. And put that there. Then I'm going to take a little bit, another little dab of my neutral, and I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna to that. So now I want to really be able to see, even though it's quite dark, I want to be able to see that it's getting more towards my burnt sienna. But if I look at this, that's still really close to that neutral. I've got to bump it over this way a little bit more. Just like, because I want my steps of variation in that saturation to be even, right? To be consistent. Okay. And then I've got to go one more step, so I'm going to go with a small little start of my neutral, and then I'm going to go with more of my burnt sienna. That's still a little ways away, closer to my neutral, so I'm going to go with a little bit more. Okay. So sort of even steps going out. Now I'm going to do the same thing going this way. I'm going to start with my neutral. Point, you can start working on your grid, or you can start to lay out your values. With each one of these, you're going to do a 9-step value scale. This is why it's going to take a minute. Okay, so so when we look at our 9-step value scale here, your last row, I want it to be not white. I want it to be as light as you can get it, as close to white as you can get it, but still be able to perceive a little bit of color. All right? So this is your lightest, this is your darkest. Ideally, and you'll be able to see where I made mistakes on this one, but I did not have time to redo it. So all my values here are as dark as I can get them. Now this is a little bit lighter over here, but only because that burnt sienna is lighter than the blue in value, but this is the darkest that it gets. So I step down to the next row. It's uniform value, so if you squint your eyes at it, they look like they're the same value. If I took a black and white photo of this, they would look very similar. Okay, here, this row, a little bit lighter in value, very consistent with all the way across having that value be the same. This row, very consistent. The whole row is uniformly lighter than the one above it. This one, pretty good, but right there, this value should be a little bit darker, right? You see that big jump right there. Here, on this row, that's where, so this should be slightly darker, this should be slightly darker, that should be slightly darker. This is really where I want to be on this row. Here, that one looks pretty good. That one looks pretty good, except for those two individual squares, and that one looks good. So if I were doing this again, I would come back and I would correct those boxes, okay? And you'll be able to see it when you do it, whether or not you're on target, right? So you can go straight back and add to, either add more paint, more color, or add more white to it. So you will end up with 9 by 9, which is 81 different, definitely different. Like I can perceive the difference in all of these. Just with blue, burnt sienna, and white, you end up with 81 different choices, right? So this project right here really shows you how much variety you can get with your paint. Yeah.